So let's make a small plate or dish out of what's called a slump mold method. So what is a slump mold? That is when we're pressing a soft piece of clay that's a slab into an existing object. You want something that is pointing outward because it's easier to take out. Definitely not something that turns inward because your slab will get stuck. Things around the house that work: paper plates or actual plates, pot dishes like from the catch tray of a planter, plastic or styrofoam trays, but be careful if there are any like little ridges or dents. This one has like a bump in the middle and that will show up. So make sure if you do have that, it's not very prominent and that you're aware of that and okay with it. So here's like an existing bowl as well. We're working from home, so keep things small. I would go no bigger than maybe 6 or 7 inches in any direction. You can also make a custom shape out of a coil. So what I'm doing here is I have a pretty large piece of clay and I'm rolling a coil. So first I kind of squeeze it in my hands to start out. Then I roll and I twist sometimes. So I'll roll and twist. And so I'm rolling mostly with the heel and palm of my hand, not so much my fingers. And I'm making sure that I'm giving attention to all the areas of the clay. So you can see my hands traveling in different directions. I want to keep this fairly thick so that I can kind of customize the shape. So I'm not going for a really tiny piece. And now you can see that I've attached this into like an oval shape, and then I'm pinching around the edges to give it a slight tilt outward. And now I can play around with shape. I can really make any shape here. Now, what you want to use for your surface really determines what your next steps are. If you want to do this impression or texture, you need to gather your texture items and actually add that to your slab before you put it in your slump mold. If you want to do something like this, which uses underglaze and masking or sgraffito, you want to make your plate first. Or if you want to do something like this where I've stamped the texture in, you also want to make your plate first. So keep in mind what you want to do. That's going to determine your next step. But ultimately, you're going to need to make a slab. So how do we do that? So you're going to grab your clay, and a slab is a flat piece of clay. So you want to start as close to flat as possible. Now my piece of clay was a little irregular already, so I don't have an exact slab, but it'll work. So you can see here, I definitely don't want to worry too much about that one edge. I want to really flatten the other end. And I like to start actually with the heel of my hand. This, of course, does depend on what your work surface is. If it's too wobbly, then don't do it this way. You could just kind of gently press it. I want to check the dimension of my slump mold. I need it larger than it actually needs to be. Think about if you're making, say, a pie, you need to account for both the bottom part and the sides. So it needs to be fairly large. And I also don't use the edges of my slab, so I want to make it larger than I ultimately need. So then I'm going to roll it out. And I usually would just roll it like regularly, but you do have the option of using slab guides. This is about a 1/4 inch thick, which is a great thickness for a slab. I wouldn't go thinner. And what happens is as I'm rolling, eventually my rolling pin will hit the slab guide and it can't go any thinner. Now, of course, if you have things like, I don't know, stir sticks or anything, like those were pieces of just random wood in the garage, that's great, but you certainly don't need a slab guide, and I'm not going to use it for my demo here. I want to be careful with my slab so that I don't tear it or rip it as I'm picking it up, but I do also want to move it as I go. You can also flatten it a little bit with your rolling pin and just rotate it so that you keep an even thickness. As I'm rolling, sometimes my rolling pin will stick. I'm just using a piece of PVC here. If you don't have a rolling pin, you can use other items around the house. Something glass or metal would work better. I wouldn't use an actual like rolling pin you use for baking, just because even though clay isn't toxic, it's not something I'd really want to mix into my kitchen items. As I'm rolling, I also am not going all the way to the edge or over the edge. So notice my rolling pin never actually leaves the surface of the clay, because if I were to roll all the way over the edge, it's going to become really thin, and then I can't use those areas. Now, if I have slab guides but my rolling pin's not long enough, I can still use them, but it just means that it won't span the entire surface. Again, slab guides are not critical. They're just like a helpful tool. Now I want to smooth and compress this. This, first of all, smooths it, and compressing gives more strength to my clay. Now clay does have a memory, so if I'm picking it up a lot, and I do pick it up to rotate it, to flip it over, I do want to treat it gently. I don't want to stress it, because it will remember that and maybe warp in the kiln. Now if I want to do that impression technique, here's the next step. I've already made my slab, and then I'm just going to roll and press my items on here. I'm using just random kind of plants from the garden, but other things like, say, lace or textured paper could work as well. So then I'm going to put it into my slump mold. In this case, I'm using a plate, and I just want to really gently press it in there because I don't want to show my finger marks, and I'm kind of tapping it on the table too. And then I'm going to cut and actually just use the edge of the plate as the guide. You could do this there are other ways that you could treat the edges, but this is just like the most simple kind of straightforward one. Now I'm not done, but that's kind of step one. Now if I wasn't doing that impression, I'm going to go next into, say, avoiding to stick things in the form. So if I'm using a terracotta piece here, it's not glazed, that will actually absorb the moisture of the clay, so I don't have to worry about it sticking. And I was just using a paper plate, so I didn't have to worry about that either. But if I'm using a glazed bowl or, say, a plastic or styrofoam tray, I want to line it with something so that I don't get my clay suctioning to that piece, because then I can't really easily take it out. This plastic creates like a little sling that I can lift it out with really easily. You will get a little bit of wrinkling from the plastic, but I find that I'd rather have that instead. Cornstarch also can work because it's non-organic, so I'll show you that in a minute. So the first example I want to show here, I'll just go through each sort of type of slump mold. The first one is with this organic shape that I've created using a coil. So you can see I'm just shaping it and making sure the edges are fairly smooth. I'm going to line it with plastic. It's not going to go all the way to the edge just because that's the shape of my plastic, but it's going to cover enough. And then I want to gently mark where this goes and actually cut it off of the piece. I'm going to cut it a little larger. Keep in mind, if you're going for asymmetrical or irregular designs, those are a lot more forgiving. You don't have to worry about exactly matching. I find that's a really great option for, say, like when you're first learning a technique or you're a beginner, right? Choose your battles here. So I've pressed that in, and that was my first one of my slump molds. So here's another one with a rounded shape. So you'll notice that the key thing is I want to think about the edges, right? What does it look like? And I ultimately am pressing it in so that the clay slumps into that form. So remember, this is a terracotta clay that isn't glazed, so I can just put my clay directly in there and it will not stick. So I'm gently pressing it in. You could also use, if you didn't want to see your finger marks, some people use, say, like a piece of fabric or a sock filled with sand that they kind of pat in there, or even a sponge, but don't get it too damp because you don't want to overhydrate. So then I actually didn't really love the scallop look here, so I might I'm going to press this in a little more, but I'm actually going to end up cutting that off. So you can see that you can be kind of flexible with what you do ultimately with your design, right? And save all those scraps because those are certainly still usable. And then, like I mentioned, you could also use cornstarch. So first I want to make sure that I'm not going right at the edges. The edges of your piece might be a little drier and they might be a little bit thinner. So don't use those exact edges of your clay. You want to use more the center of your slab. So cornstarch is an organic material, so it will burn out, and it creates kind of this non-stick area. It is not critical. I could just use a piece of plastic instead. So now I'm just gently pressing and shaping to, again, let this slump into my mold. So you can just see with all these examples that there's a lot of variety that you can get, and I can even tap it on the table to help force that clay in there. And now I can do just like you've seen before. I'm cutting around those edges, using the edge of my form as my guide. All right, so that's it of step one. You're gonna have to clean up these edges. Now don't forget to wipe your tools down before they get too dry and start creating crumbs everywhere. Let your clay dry to damp leather hard before you do things like cleaning up edges, adding underglaze, adding a foot or other details, or taking it out of the mold, and then we'll move on.